A Timeline of World War II, 1939 to 1945. This book is an introduction to World War II. It explains why and how the war started, and the important battles and dramatic events during the war. Part 2 goes from 1942 to 1943. A recap of years 1939 to 1941. World War II started on September 1st, 1939. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany and its Nazi party, invaded Poland. Shortly thereafter, the British and French declared war on Germany due to the Anglo-French-Polish Mutual Assistance Treaty. Thus started a 6-year-long war which resulted in millions of casualties. Over the next few months, the world saw the annexation of West Poland by Germany and East Poland by the Soviet Union. In 1940, the Blitzkrieg of the Wehrmacht proved to be extremely effective. In German, Blitzkrieg means lightning war. The doctrine was to focus all troops to win a lightning-fast war, thus avoiding long, bloody conflicts. Before the Germans had used this strategy, the rest of the world was still somewhat oblivious to it. Norway, Denmark, and France all fell before July. In 1941, the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo axis seemed to be gaining control. All three of the main Axis nations were upset by their gains or losses after World War I and looked hungrily to expand territory. The aim of the 1941 Allies, which included Britain, America, the Soviet Union, and China, was to halt the expansion of the Axis. German and Italian forces were engaging the British in the searing heat of the Sahara. Meanwhile, the Russians were being overwhelmed by invading Germans during the devastating Operation Barbarossa. On the other side of the world, Japan, which had been at war against China since 1937, attacked the Allies. On December 7, 1941, Japan simultaneously assaulted British and Dutch colonies in East Asia while bombing Pearl Harbor. This ultimately triggered the US to enter the war. Shock. Almost immediately after Japan committed the perfidious acts of war, its forces swept through Asia. The Japanese landed in the US-held Philippines and started weeding out the island chain's defenders. Similarly, defenders of Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies, and British Malaya watched with shock as the fanatical attackers descended on their ranks. The Dutch East Indies, with its historical capital, Batavia, would soon surrender. So did the Philippines. When the last bit of resistance was weeded out, 78,000 captured Filipino and American soldiers were forced to march 65 miles. This brutal war crime would later be known as the Bataan Death March. Unfortunately, many of the prisoners of war succumbed to injuries, diseases, and the rifle barrel of their Japanese captors. While the Bataan Death March traumatized the Americans, the British were horrified at the loss of Singapore, an impregnable fortress. More than 80,000 Commonwealth troops surrendered, and 2 of the prides of the Royal Navy sank in defense of the island. Confrontation. In mid-1942, the Americans stumbled by a miraculous revelation. The Americans had already engaged the Japanese in the Battle of the Coral Sea, which was the first battle in which 2 sides fought without seeing each other. The Battle of the Coral Sea turned out to be a draw, with neither side gaining an edge over another. A month after the Battle of the Coral Sea, codebreakers in Hawaii learned that the Japanese planned to ambush the Americans by setting a trap at Midway Atoll. This knowledge allowed the Americans the upper hand in the Battle of Midway. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk at the price of 1 American carrier. The Japanese were never able to recover from this crippling defeat, and Midway is considered the turning point of the Pacific War. The African Front. A year had passed since the start of the seesaw battles in the North African Front. The Italians had already become demoralized, but the legendary German general Erwin Rommel built the Axis Africa Front to keep fighting. Rommel fought with such skill that Allied newspapers grudgingly nicknamed him the Desert Fox. Rommel and his troops had advanced to El Alamein, Egypt. However, British Field Marshal Montgomery's 8th Army was able to intercept and destroy German convoys. At El Alamein, Montgomery decisively defeated the Germans, sending the Desert Fox scurrying back to Libya. The Americans and Free French landed at beaches in Morocco, thus starting Operation Torch. Slowly, Rommel found his forces being trapped between two Allied armies in Tunisia. For Mother Russia! At the end of 1941, the Russians had stopped the relentless German advance at Moscow. In 1942, however, most of the German attention had turned to the city of Stalingrad, a historical town on the bank of the Volga River. The German 6th Army had already been engaging Russian forces in the city, to no significant effect. Hitler ordered the 6th Army to press on, but this action only further weakened the forces. This tactical error allowed the Russians to encircle the 6th Army. The Germans would keep fighting uselessly until 1943. The end of the Battle of Stalingrad saw the entire German 6th Army annihilated. Blood on the Blue. After the Americans defeated the Japanese at the Battle of Midway, the American High Command planned an attack of Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. This assault, known as Operation Cartwheel, started August 7, 1942. The Americans landed on Guadalcanal, starting a bloody seesaw battle which lasted until February of 1943. The main objective of the battle was to capture a strategic airfield, Henderson Field. However, the Japanese garrison fought tooth and nail. Out on the sea near Guadalcanal, American fleets engaged Japanese fleets, further weakening the Imperial Japanese Navy. In the end, after more than 7,000 men died, the Americans secured control of the island. In late 1943, the Japanese lost Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands to America, again with massive loss of life. Italy's downfall. With Rommel's defeat in North Africa, the Western Allies started to plan the invasion of Europe's soft underbelly. Italy, with its recent failures, had drawn the attention of the Anglo-American High Command. In July of 1943, the first phase of Italy's invasion had started, Operation Husky. In 6 weeks of bloodshed, the Axis defenders of the southern Italian island, Sicily, had fled for mainland Italy. Mussolini, the Italian dictator, was arrested shortly after by the Italian monarch. In response, German troops poured into Italy to defend its weak ally. Finally, Americans and British land at Salerno, just south of Naples. It takes hard fighting, but Salerno and Naples finally fall to the Allies. The end of Part 2.